We're now a few weeks into the season in the church year known as Ordinary Time. We haven't got any big festivals like Christmas, Easter or Pentecost, and we're not getting ready for them or reflecting back on them either. In Ordinary Time, church hangings and clergy stoles are green, seen as an ordinary colour. And instead of our weekly readings focusing on specific events surrounding Jesus' birth, death and resurrection, or the start of the early church, the focus instead in our gospel readings is on Jesus' teaching and ministry. We hear about some of the miracles he did and hear the parables, the stories he told to help people know God better and understand what God's kingdom is all about. This is called Ordinary Time, but what it's about is anything but ordinary. We're told that Jesus spoke with great wisdom and authority in the synagogue in today's readings, that those listening, those who had seen him grow up and follow in Joseph's footsteps becoming a carpenter, were astounded at what they heard. And even when his power was limited because of the lack of faith in the people in his hometown, all Jesus was able to do was heal some sick people through prayer. That's pretty amazing. It's certainly not ordinary, and none of Jesus' ministry was. In this passage, Jesus also commissioned and sent the disciples out into the surrounding area, giving them authority, power over unclean spirits, over powers of darkness that were causing damage to people's health and lives. The disciples, they were ordinary people, fishermen, tax collectors, a political extremist amongst them. They all did amazing things in God's name, casting out the evil that was oppressing the people and bringing physical healing to many. The thing is, we have an amazing, powerful, awesome God who transforms lives, who brings light into the darkness, who brings new life out of decay and death. And sometimes we forget how extraordinary that is. Those of us who have been hearing these readings year in, year out, sometimes forget how shocking what happened would have been to those who were there and to those who hear and understand it for the first time today. And while we might start to see God as a bit ordinary and mundane, a bit like those from Jesus' hometown saw him, we can forget that the extraordinary God loves, celebrates, and calls the ordinary. As I've already said, the disciples were ordinary people called by Jesus to follow him, to learn from him, and in doing so, they quite literally helped change the world. They changed history by God working through the ordinary people that they were. And we see it in the life of the Apostle Paul, who we hear from this week in his letter to the church in Corinth. He went from being someone who hated Jesus, hated the early church and all that it stood for. He made it his business to do all that he could to destroy it. And then he went from that having the most amazing conversion experience to becoming one of the biggest supporters of the early church. He tells us he doesn't know if it happened physically or whether it was a vision. It doesn't really matter. The important thing was that on the road to Damascus, he encountered the living, risen Jesus and started following him and working to grow the church rather than destroy it. And we're told in this passage that something in his life keeps him grounded, that keeps him humble, that kept him ordinary. He describes it as a thorn in the flesh. There's been a lot of speculation about what that might be, maybe physical illness, depression, some kind of strong temptation. Again, the details don't really matter. What does matter is that this thorn reminds him when he does amazing things in God's name, that it's God who is amazing, not Paul. Paul was another ordinary person who did extraordinary things for God. As he puts it, he might have weaknesses, but God is strong, and those weaknesses in Paul's life don't stop God acting through him. God works through ordinary people to change the world, to bring healing, to grow God's kingdom. God has been doing this for thousands of years, and God still does it today. God works through every single one of us ordinary people, if we let him. God calls each one of us to be part of his kingdom, part of growing his kingdom. None of us are too ordinary or too insignificant. Each of us has a part to play. Each of us can get involved in God's great story. We all have flaws and weaknesses. And do you know what? I think that's a good thing, because it keeps us from thinking we're better than we are. It keeps us from thinking that it's all about us. It reminds us that we need each other and that we need God at work in our lives. I think we tend to err one way or the other. Either we think we're extraordinary and forget that we need God, or we think we're too ordinary for God to be at work in us. Neither is the full picture. We are all extraordinary. There is no one else exactly like you. Nobody could replace you. You are unique and so very special to God. And yet, we're also all totally ordinary. No matter the differences in our lives, at a fundamental level, we are all very similar. We are all very ordinary. In God's kingdom, nobody is more special than anyone else because of what they can or cannot do. Whichever of those two ways you tend to err, the good news is that God is calling you to follow Jesus, calling you to be part of God's kingdom, calling you to help grow God's kingdom. Without you, the picture is incomplete. Without you, something precious and unique is missing from God's story. The last year or so has given us a lot to reflect on. There has been a lot of talk about what life will be like when all this is behind us. What will the new normal look like? There is still quite a bit of uncertainty. At the moment, I can't even tell wedding couples what they'll be able to have in their marriage services next month, or how many people they'll be able to have in the church. But I am certain that God is calling each one of us to follow Jesus into that uncertain future. That God is calling each of us to be part of the kingdom that he is building for the future. That God is calling each of us, ordinary people, to do extraordinary things. That each of us has a unique part to play in bringing light, hope, joy, peace, and love into this suffering world. God is calling each of us, ordinary people, to be part of something special in whatever the new normal looks like. Ask God to show you what you're being called to. Ask God to show you how you can help build the kingdom. Give God permission to do extraordinary things in and through your life. If you're not sure where to start, have a chat with someone else from church. Have a chat with me. Often others can see the gifts that we're not aware of ourselves. The extraordinary God does want to do extraordinary things through the ordinary you.